So I mentioned this issue with like the profit caps, that they're just getting rid of that because the investors want them to get rid of it. But it's not just that, it's the whole question of nonprofit control. Even though they transitioned to this hybrid structure in 2019, where this nonprofit had kind of complete managerial control over the for-profit entity, they're now restructuring to something that looks a lot more like a typical for-profit. Originally, the plan was spin out a new public benefit corporation, have that be a for-profit entity, and have the nonprofit exist somewhere on the side, just making typical charitable grants. They said like, supporting like medicine and education or something, which is great. Like I love supporting medicine and education, but it's not particularly relevant to the thing that OpenAI, the nonprofit, was founded to do, which was to make sure that OpenAI's development of AGI benefits all of humanity. And in fact, I should clarify that because as Greg Brockman, the president of OpenAI, says, the mission was not for OpenAI necessarily to develop AGI. It was just to make sure AGI goes well. So it didn't have to be OpenAI developing it. They were just meant to be out there making sure that this development went well. Or so they said in 2020 or so. Sure. Obviously, they've changed their tune on
just
that.
A lifeguard, making sure nobody drowns at the pool. We'll just make sure everything's fine.
Yeah. So, the idea, like in the structure that exists today, because of that deep managerial control, if it were the case that OpenAI were to decide that GPT-5 is too dangerous to release, the nonprofit could make that assessment and they could tell OpenAI, the for-profit, to hold off on releasing it. Similarly, if it was like perfectly aligned and they decided this is so economically valuable that we shouldn't just like try to do rent seeking on top of the model weights, but we should in fact distribute it freely to developing countries, the nonprofit could make that choice also. In either case, investors would be pretty unhappy, but investors wouldn't get to do anything because the top of all the investment documents that they signed, there's this thing saying, treat this as a donation, not an investment, because OpenAI is not a typical company. It's a nonprofit that is doing this for public good and not guaranteeing you any particular returns from your investment. That is what's changing. So OpenAI...
And that is the current state. What you just described is the current state, and the changes are in the works.
That's the current state, yeah. So around the end of last year, OpenAI announced, we're done with this structure. What we're going to try to do, they hadn't yet completed it, but they announced plans for this, was to totally spin off this new for-profit company. And that would just end up being very typical to like a Google or something where it would have obligations to shareholders and it would be pursuing profit maximization. They specified it as a public benefit corporation. As I've learned more about this, I've become very pessimistic about whether public benefit corporations have any teeth whatsoever. So, one key difference that I'll draw out here is that a public benefit corporation is entitled to make decisions that balance shareholder interests against the mission, which is very different from being obligated to prioritize the mission. You've moved from a regime where you place the public interest above shareholder interests to a regime where you have to balance those interests. And in fact, shareholders could sue you for not adequately prioritizing the interest. Now, you might still feel some reassurance in the fact that there is some consideration of the mission that still exists in a public benefit corporation, but I don't think you should feel a lot, because the primary way that would be enforced would be through a shareholder suing the public benefit corporation for not adequately pursuing the mission, which feels very unlikely to me on account of the fact that the shareholders do not want the mission to be pursued when it supersedes their interests. And in fact, this isn't just like idle speculation. They want to become a Delaware public benefit corporation. In the more than a decade since that corporate structure was invented, there has not been a single case, a single documented case of a shareholder suing to protect the public interest mission. So
go figure.
Yeah, as a matter of fact, it doesn't seem like the mission means much at all when it comes to public benefit corporations, or at least nothing with teeth. And so OpenAI did get some pushback on this from civil society groups, and it seems from the attorneys general of California and Delaware, who both announced that they were looking into this. As a result of this in May, they announced, we've changed our mind and we decided we're going to leave the nonprofit in control. This is what they said, and a lot of the media kind of uncritically reported on this. And they thought, oh great, the critics won, the attorney general won, the OpenAI nonprofit is staying in control. One of the main things that I want to draw out in the OpenAI files is that I don't think it's that simple. I think OpenAI Comms has actually done something quite cynical, where they've realized that there's like a double meaning to control that they could play on. So what they've done is they've made it so the nonprofit can appoint directors to the public benefit company. They're losing that managerial control as far as we can tell, where they're no longer going to be able to make decisions about what exactly is happening at that company. That's going to be made by the directors of the public benefit corporation, but the nonprofit is allowed to appoint that board. One reason you might be concerned about this is that there's this question of like fiduciary duties, where the nonprofit currently has a fiduciary duty to humanity as the beneficiaries of the OpenAI mission. The public benefit corporation has a new fiduciary duty to shareholders. And so like, even if the nonprofit were to do some galaxy brain thing where they're like, we're going to appoint new directors to the public benefit corporation who we think are going to like exercise our will to say, refrain from releasing GPT-5 or release it for free or whatever the case may be. Once those directors are now controlling the new public benefit corporation, they have a new set of fiduciary duties that can constrain their actions and make it such that they could be sued by the shareholders if they're not taking the shareholders' interests into account. So in fact, OpenAI is still getting a lot of what they wanted, right? Like they're removing the profit caps. They're creating a new public benefit corporation that will allow them to IPO one day without these like profit participation units or without the, complicated, this is a donation, because the nonprofit has complete control. It's going to just look more like a typical company. And in fact, I think they will, if this goes through, go public in a year or two. And so not much is changing. And SoftBank has said this. SoftBank said at their investor call recently, they're like, oh yeah, we think that nothing has changed here and we're still down for our $40 billion, which is an amount of money that they said they were going to put in if and only if OpenAI restructures. And so even though OpenAI said we're changing our mind and we're going to leave the nonprofit in control, their current plan actually looks a lot like their former plan. And as far as we can tell, they've just kind of thrown the word control in by holding forward this fig leaf that actually, like, there might be some benefit to, which is having the nonprofit appoint the public benefit corporation's directors, but then still getting a lot of the benefits that they wanted from the restructuring.
And what is standing in the way of Altman from doing what he wants? Who is it the Attorney General? Is it who is the other team here?
So technically, the nonprofit board are the people that are supposed to be representing humanity's interests here. And they are Altman's boss, but it's a little complicated because Altman is on that board. He's one of 9 people. And I also think we should be concerned about the other people on that board, because I think there are some really deep conflicts of interest on that board. And this is something else we talk about in the OpenAI files. So the chair of that board is Brett Taylor. Brett Taylor is kind of a longtime tech entrepreneur. He runs what I believe now is a $4.5 billion business called Sierra that last we looked at, like, their sub-processors list is primarily selling OpenAI's models. They're, what could be pejoratively called like a wrapper company, where they take OpenAI's models like GPT 4.5 and they fine tune it to be really good at customer service, and then they sell that. And so he's running, $4 billion business selling OpenAI's models, and he's the chair of the nonprofit board that is meant to be holding Altman to account and is approving this restructuring. Yeah, and typically in a nonprofit, if you have these kind of deep financial conflicts of interest where you could personally lose tens of millions of dollars of your net worth, you would recuse yourself from any decision related to this. Brett Taylor has openly talked about the board's plans in the media in a way that indicates he has not recused himself from these discussions. I'm not in the boardroom because
how does he
closed.
Get to be the chair of the board? And this is after the board shakeup, the whole thing. He's brought in.
Yeah, he's brought in to lead it. And in fact, when he was brought in, I don't know if he was running Sierra, because I believe he was at Salesforce at the time, and he I have to double check the exact timing here. I think it might have been a couple months after he was brought in that he started Sierra. It was around that time. So some of this has been subtle. And then, in I think the beginning of this year, they brought in Adebayo Ogunlesi, who he is a longtime investor in infrastructure and energy. And he runs this, he's a $2.2 billion net worth. He runs this investment firm called Global Infrastructure Partners. And he is at public forums that we found said, we're building data centers for all the hyperscalers. He is, insofar as the AI game has become an energy game, he is the person who is putting the investment dollars behind the companies that are powering and building the data centers. And, he's another member of this nonprofit board that's meant to be representing humanity's best interests in the decision about OpenAI's restructuring, the decision whether to remove profit caps, the decision whether to keep Altman in charge, the decision whether to have the nonprofit continue to have managerial control of the for-profit. So I really don't think
Did Altman pick the new board? Where is this hand, he blew up the old thing and then put these people in their seats?
When the old thing was blown up, there was a very contentious process of coming up with new candidates for the board. And
I bet.
I think it's been reported that Altman was vetoing most of the people that the old board was suggesting. And so the very first 3 people that came on board were agreed upon between all the parties. But you could also raise questions about whether that was an agreement that was made under duress or under extremely far from ideal circumstances. on account of the fact that they had to agree. And if they didn't, Altman and all of his employees were just going to go work for Microsoft.